Thank you everyone for joining today for our Salesforce Financial Services Cloud Bootcamp Part 1. We would be having Bootcamp Part 1 today and Bootcamp Part 2 tomorrow. So we have split the functionalities between 2 days. So definitely make sure that you attend today as well as tomorrow. Our presenter today would be Scott Bravo. And my name is Gurleen Singh, your host. Thank you for joining today, Scott.
Good evening.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Grabo. I'm a principal consultant with Slalom Consulting, which is Salesforce's largest FSC consulting partner. I've been a solutions and technical architect for a long time, working in Salesforce since the Force.com platform first was introduced. It's been a journey. I have also been working with FSC, of course, since its original launch and seeing it grow. My background is in consulting in general, but with a particular specialization in financial services, which is what got me involved in FSC. And I like to think of myself as a reformed executive. I've had, CIO, CTO, other kind of C-suite work, and decided that really what I loved was consulting and learning the way the tools work, the way different organizations need to use them, and how I can make that happen.
Would you like to share your screen?
Sure. Are we gonna go ahead and do the poll?
Yes. So I'm going to share one poll, and we would like to have your feedback before we start the session today. So it's just one question poll that I have, and I would love if everyone could give their opinion on the same. Anyone who has not had a chance to fill in the poll, please go ahead and.
Hey, Gurleen, I have a question. So if I'm not an administrator or like a consultant, like I'm a developer, what is the option that I can choose?
You can just go for consultant, that's fine.
Sorry?
You can just write consultant.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just for everybody's edification, we're just, I asked that we ask this question ahead of time so that I have a sense of what level of detail I should be going into on some of these items. I didn't want to be making a lot of people's eyes roll back in their head with boredom as I go over technical stuff, nor did I want to go at so high a level that the technical folks are saying, oh, get to it. So that's why we ask the questions, just to help guide the conversation.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah.
Hey, hi, Gurleen. I'm not able to see any polls. I think I joined, or I was pulled into this meeting a bit late.
Okay.
That's okay. I think that I've got a pretty good sense based on those that have already signed up, kind of where people are, ballpark.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, I think we are good.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. We would continue with the event now.
All right, you want me to take over the screen now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yep. All right. So what we're going to be going over today is just sort of an overview of functionality. This is more of a survey than an in-depth training, right? The intent here is not that people are able to hit the ground running building, but just to make sure people are familiar with the scope and some of the key core elements of the platform. The main items we want to talk about are what's at the core of it. What are the major things we talk about when we talk about FSC? What is it really built on? What are the main attractions to it? The core stuff around it has to do with relationships and householding. It's a really important thing. We're going to talk about that. Different ways of sharing information, and a couple of specialty things, particularly data processing engine. So any questions that we have, there's going to be time at the end of some of these sections to ask questions. We can handle some there, and we can also ask and handle some questions at the end. I've left some time for Q&A at the end of it. If you do have questions in the meantime, feel free to post them in the chat. Gurleen is going to be monitoring that, and we can tackle some of those here and there. All right. So what is this core offering? The FSC platform is really Salesforce with a number of elements added in. The way that FSC calls out and is somewhat different is in a few key areas. So advisor insights are what Salesforce calls this ability to carefully map all of the client's relationships, particularly in a financial environment. That's very important to understand who's got the primary ownership of accounts, sure, but who's everybody they talk to. That helps with marketing, and that helps you to track more lead efficacy and to get better handles on their financial goals and life events, let better service be provided overall. One big element, and this does have to do with third party as well, is the ability to onboard new clients. What that really says is that we're leveraging a common data store, right? We're going to drive mastering from that common data store. We're going to say that all your client information and all these details you gather about the client can be centralized in one location and then shared out to either other systems to consume that data, or build onboarding within Salesforce to have just a single pane of glass that we work on for every client. That ecosystem, where there is a lot of stuff related to account opening, but data aggregation, data feed, performance measurement, there's a whole lot of stuff in there. New account opening and data aggregations being the two biggest pieces. And there's a lot of third-party app and ecosystem stuff built around the FSC model specifically, rather than Salesforce in general. And then finally, we get to some of those highly specialized integrations. You've got financial planning and money management, InvestNet with Money Guide, all kinds of performance dashboards that you can pull in. There's all kinds of special integrations available. And like everything else, you can do these with, it will support your own world of custom integrations like anything else in Salesforce. So the main takeaway here is that it is just Salesforce, right? It's Salesforce with a bunch of new stuff added in. Some of it is added in from other elements of the Salesforce world called the Salesforce industries. And some of it is very specific to financial services. So what's the basic architecture of this? Fundamentally, it's built on the core platform, right? So it is an industry cloud offering. That means that all of the stuff of the core platform is available, and then it begins to get, interacts with the sales cloud, with service cloud. A number of common services are pretty routinely used here. Scheduler is very common to pull into this. And recently, there have been some additions that let, MuleSoft, which is a Salesforce product at this point, Marketing Cloud, those two are now interacting well with the architecture specifically of FSC, but all of this is general Salesforce. So this is the environment and the framework that FSC sits on. those clouds get extended with a series of custom schemas with supporting automation, a number of industry components, a number of enhancements. All of those get built out to capture very specific elements that are of particular value in a financial services environment. Now, I do actually have clients that are using FSC without any number of these particular visual elements, without pieces of the data architecture, because of some of the integration capabilities and because they want to cherry pick some of these schema elements to use and not others. So there's enough power in there in the custom components and the custom schema to drive a lot of situations. It's just more specially focused on financial services, as you'd expect. On top of that is the intelligence layer, which, yes, it's got the basics of Salesforce reporting, but then it's also got the Tableau CRM capabilities, formerly Einstein capabilities built on top of that, with some add-on stuff that lets you say, okay, what are some very specific wealth management analytics and dashboards? How do I look at insurance differently, right? How do I handle referring intelligently? All of these things are part of the offering. Several of them are add-on pieces, but they're all part of the offering. Then on top of, whoops, why did that go there? On top of Experience Cloud, on top of all of that can sit Experience Cloud. There are some challenges in Experience Cloud with making sure that the sharing model works right, and that just takes some practice to get right. But again, it's just Salesforce. And then finally, there's the whole partner ecosystem. So the main piece that we'll be focusing on is this piece in the middle, these purple elements that talk about those specific data models and those specific components. Those are the real value that is being brought in. The licensing is all done through permission sets. When you open up the organization, when you are going to grant permission to this, you're doing it all via permission set, and that's handled for FSC in general. There's specialized permission sets for insurance and for mortgage and for loan application. There are a number of them involved, and it just takes some admin to get used to which ones to enable in which persona, but it's all permission set driven, and it's all about the PSLs. There are a number of pieces like action plans, which are built into this, that are they're free, but they do take a separate PSL that you've got to install separately. It does come with some base number of surveys. It's not very robust, but it's available. Einstein, I guess I probably should rename that Tableau CRM. That has been added in 2 layers. It's basically a freemium offering, right? So there's a basic pair of dashboards, mainly around My Book of Business, that are built on Tableau and shareable through components in Salesforce. That's part of what's built in, but then as add-ons, you can buy a whole set of specialized dashboards, or you can have those, you have the ability to build all of your own just using Tableau CRM as it stands. Lightning Scheduler is a pretty common add-in to be able to schedule meetings with clients that are captured to do health checks on their portfolios, etc. That's add-on licensing. And then an important one is the data processing engine. Because if you're dealing with large volumes of data, and we'll touch on this later, you need to be able to use Tableau CRM to perform aggregations and calculations of that, because of the volume is just too high for Salesforce to handle effectively. That you do get one license to use that. It comes with it. It doesn't mean that you get the entire Tableau CRM platform, but you do get the piece of it supporting these kinds of aggregations. Now, the licensing cost for FSC is a big jump. It's a lot more than what you're going to pay for a standard enterprise license, but you get a lot for it. I say it's a lot more. That's a discussion to have with an account exec, right? I'm maybe those of you that are in the consulting world will know we don't talk dollars for Salesforce products. It's worth talking to your AE about that, but there's a lot that you get for that licensing. So what exactly makes it special? When FSC was first introduced, it was really about a new schema with a bunch of triggers that drive behavior that's kind of cool, and the ability to have a relationship map. There wasn't a whole lot more that made it special. It has grown tremendously and is now really around components and automation. So all that native stuff is included, right? That's already part of it. On top of that is the whole custom schema. This is just a sampling. You do get an entire financial account management schema, insurance management schema. Some of the ones I like are like assets and liabilities, a way to keep track of, what are all their real estate properties and how do those relate to the mortgages they've got? What are their financial goals? Identification documents, you can keep track of their passport IDs as opposed to their driver's license, as opposed to their national health number, whatever it may be. That's really valuable in onboarding. The first really big FSC only piece is the relationship groups. And this is where you have the ability to see all of the relationships for an individual. You have the ability to household them. It becomes such a standard way of viewing client relationships that I don't even look at related lists anymore, right? Looking at related contacts and related accounts has now become just sort of passe. It's hard to use those when you're accustomed to using this. It's pretty slick. There's another form of it called the Actionable Relationship Center, which does allow you to click on any one client and sort of navigate through all of their relationships and all of their related records and navigate your way down through that. It's a little bit awkward because it's sort of a dense display and it scrolls horizontally. There are a number of enhancements coming to it to allow greater configuration, and greater sort of metadata driven tweaking. That's pretty handy. Next big one I would call out, depending on the industry you're in, would be document checklist. This does allow you to say, we need them to give us a W-2, a driver's license, pay stub, last year's 1040, whatever. And that becomes a task list that is document driven. As you upload the documents, they mark them as being required, which can also be tracked via triggers. So you can have other behavior that ties into that. Life events is actually really cool. So I think that all of us that have worked with Salesforce know that it's a little bit awkward to, sometimes you have to have a special text area that says important notes or most recent events or the stuff to think about. One of the real benefits of life events is that you're able to set up a whole series of common events. What is their job changes? What are birthdays? What's education, etc. And those just get placed in it. You can put those in a banner across the top and then track all of the events related to them. So it's a really cool way to see what's the most recent thing that's happened. It's a great way to orient yourself to a client very quickly, especially if that client is new to use. I have, and this will be discussed in detail tomorrow when Walter does his side of it. I found one really helpful way to do this is a little bit of automation that says, it's going to, based on today's date, it's going to pop an event that says their anniversary as a client is coming up, and that moves all the way to the left and it's in the top. And now as you look at them, you get reminded immediately, oh, their anniversary is coming up. Maybe I want to do something with that. That's pretty cool. I don't mean wedding anniversary. I mean like, customer since. That's pretty handy. Alerts is a really simple little component with a very simple schema that allows you to put like critical backend events, which is really what it was initially intended for. Like through integration, we discovered that there's an overdraft or there's an approval pending somewhere, or there's some other issue. I mean, you want to call that out. Anybody that looks at the client is going to see this immediately. It really applies only to account and financial account. Those are the real main areas where it's used, is account and financial account. And so it kind of limits its functionality. I'd really love to see this extended to custom objects, but it's very slick. These are basically set up as records. There's a schema that says what are the alerts, which means you can control who sees them and who's allowed to dismiss them. It's kind of nice. Interaction summaries is a new way of thinking about like tracking what interactions have I had with this client. When you have a meeting and there's several people in the meeting, you and the advisor and the assistant and another consultant is involved, plus there are 3 people there on the client side and you're meeting with all of them. I want to track all of that stuff, know all the attendees, but importantly, I want to be able to share the notes from this confidentially. So you say that I'm going to create an interaction. I have some kind of interaction I've had with them. I have an introductory call. And then you say, based on the role that somebody plays for that client, I'm going to share the notes with them. And so you can have multiple summaries of the same interaction and share just those. It's really important when you've got confidential information you don't want everybody to have. You can conditionally choose what information gets shown simply by choosing what kind of participants you share it with. Now, the data processing engine is really focused on managing large data sets. And that there's a whole setup and configuration for it. It is a sort of new terminology and a new way of thinking about how you build interaction with Salesforce. And we'll go over that a little bit later. But if you're talking about bringing in, as is pretty common in the financial world, you've got, you've got hundreds of thousands of clients and they've got millions of financial accounts. Trying to aggregate that information to make it reportable is a real challenge with native Salesforce. So this allows you to take care of that very simply and pretty quickly. Action plans, it's a remake of the old AppExchange tool, which has been around for a long time. It's got a much nicer management user interface. It's baked into the platform. It's got some additional controls. It's got dependencies, and that's an area that's going to be talked about by Walter tomorrow. So those are the key functional pieces that are coming out of this. There are other things. I'm giving you just a surface view of it. But those are the main functional elements overall. There is, of course, the world of commercial lending that's supported with Encino, retail client onboarding, especially for investment management, which Science as an AppExchange package works. You got Guidewire to manage insurance interactions. So there's all kinds of AppExchange pieces that fit on top of that. And all of those together are part of the value that comes out of FSC. So this first piece, I said that first piece of it was relationship management. Before I go too deep into relationship management, I want to do a quick word about person accounts. In classic Salesforce, and some of you I'm sure have worked with person accounts, and it may be new to some of you. In the classic Salesforce, you've got an account, and that account has got several contacts, right? The account has its own ID, and the contact has both its own ID plus a reference to the account it belongs to. The contacts are completely dependent on an account. In a retail world, this is difficult, right? You're dealing with individual customers. So how do you create those individual customers? You do it using person accounts. So a person account is a combination of an account and a contact, where you've got, for every person account, you have both an account record and a contact record. That does mean it hits your data quota twice. So it's a consideration. What happens is your contact fields get replicated onto the account object. All of your contact fields, every single contact field, every field you create on a contact is automatically part of the account. And now you stop dealing with the contact. This is a record type of account. You create a record type of account called person account, and then all of the fields that are part of a contact attached to that person account, and you start to maintain them as such, right? You maintain them as an account. You just stop looking at the contact at all. So I've got a record that represents Scott. There's no organization I belong to. I'm just Scott. And the way you reference me is as an account. You stop looking at my contact, you only look at my account. That's the person account model. And that person account model is really the one that should be used in FSC. They used to have two different ones where you could go person account or classic. They're moving away from that. It's one model, and you use person accounts to represent people. My experience is that while you can have business accounts and person accounts coexist, that's fine. You don't want to have person accounts and regular contacts. You want to just rely on person accounts alone and not even deal with the contact object at all. It becomes way too complicated to try to reconcile a lot of that. So the main reason that we call this out is that person account sits in the middle of all of this. So all you have to do is reference the account object when you're joining from any number of different things, when you're creating a financial account and you're joining, when you are creating employment history and joining, it will figure out whether or not you're talking about a contact or an account just by looking at the person account. So this is a central part of FSC. And the core element here is when you create, you live in accounts. Some accounts like household, they group clients together. Other things connect, other junctions connect clients to each other. The clients are connected directly to financial accounts. They own that financial account. And they can be further described by their employment, by education, and by anything else. Accounts do sit at the center. The client data all revolves around it. You can't have an insurance policy or financial account or anything else without having an account record. Those things become necessary. So semantically, to think about this structure in FSC, we're really saying that the account sits in the middle, and then you just deal with multiple account record types, right? That's all you're talking about. You may have a household record type. That's an FSC specific one. You may have person accounts, but multiple types of person accounts, which is fine. You may have multiple types of business accounts. That's fine. Those are all just different types of accounts. And then you connect everything back to those. You leverage what financial accounts any given account is related to through financial account role. That is a custom object in FSC. So these ones that are highlighted in blue are the FSC specific ones. The other ones are just standard record type behavior. Okay, what types of accounts you define, what record types you define, that is what drives the way relationships are built. So you have custom metadata that says you're allowed to have a person account showing on the relationship map. You're allowed to have this specific type of person account showing on the relationship map. So you can control when you create your person accounts, that drives the whole value that you get from doing relationship mapping. The reason that I'm saying to stay away from using both person accounts and contacts is that it gets way too complicated. If let's say that you have Joe and Jane, who are your individual clients. Joe and Jane are married and you have financial accounts with them and you're their advisor and you manage them. Those are just person accounts and you just deal with them. Well, there's a law firm you deal with also. The law firm has a lawyer called Frank. Well, customarily, you'd make Frank a contact. Making Frank a contact is fine. He belongs to that law firm. You can draw relationships to him until Frank becomes your client. Now, their lawyer, you've managed to find out who their lawyer is. You talk to the lawyer comes on as a client. Well, how are they your client now? Clients need to be person accounts. Okay, so now you've got to create another person account to represent Frank. That kind of stuff starts to get very confusing. So, and the security around it gets more complicated, and all of the ways that you map relationships becomes more complicated. Stick with one, stick with person accounts. So every individual human that you describe in the platform should be a person account. So the householding is really the killer app for the financial services world and for FSC. It allows you to do visualizations of the relationships. It allows you to get aggregated roll-ups. It allows you to describe their family relationships in sophisticated ways. And it drives a lot of other behavior in the platform. And we'll talk about that other behavior in just a second. But this householding, this concept of householding is really central to FSC. This is one area where they are continuing to enhance the behaviors of FSC, to the automation, the interface is all around more and more sophisticated ways of understanding what a household is. So one thing I want to be clear about is that FSC is absolutely a B2C supporting framework. This is all about supporting individual clients, right? So if it's all about supporting individual clients, it doesn't say you can't have businesses, but then you have to deal with businesses in a special way. This is really about supporting your individual people. That's what the financial services world is all about. So what does householding really do? Well, let's talk about a family. Let's take an example here. So we've got Shelly. She's got her own, this is a client. She's sort of the matriarch of this family. She's got opportunities we're pursuing with her. She has financial accounts, activities. We track all of those things around Shelley. Shelley's a person account that we're tracking. Shelley is married to Gerald, who's got his own stuff, right? We track those around Gerald. They've got these kids and they've set up separate trusts for their kids. In the classic Salesforce environment, this is a complex web to try to understand, looking at a single record. How exactly do you join all of these together when you have to be able to deal with them independently, but then know their dependencies? That's a complex environment. In FSC, it says, well, we're going to join you into a household for which Shelley is going to be our primary member. She's our head of household. And we're going to then aggregate all of that, all those opportunities, all those financial accounts, all their activities. We aggregate all of those up together, right? So now we have a view of them individually. We have a view of them within the household. We have a view of their individual value. We have a view of their group value. And then we can say, well, you know what? We can still maintain his relationship to his employer, which has other employees. One of those employees has another one of those employees is our client. So now we've got Pam, and Pam is married to Jim. They've got their own stuff that we track individually. They go in their own household. She's the head of that household, right? We do also know that, by the way, these guys are related. This is how Pam ended up getting her job at Dunder Mifflin. We know that Shelley and Jim have a relationship. Maybe she's his aunt. I don't know. So we can track that relationship. We can also just make her a member of the household without actually counting any of her dollars in that household. She's just a member. So if I look at that household, I know she's an influencer in that household. So all of these relationships get tracked together. And what this means on a technical level is we've got three main components that are tracking those relationships. When we say that all of these four, that Shelley and Gerald and Honey and Jerry Jr., they're all a member of the Addams family household. Well, they're all person accounts. And the Addams family household, whoops, go back. The Addams family household is an account, not a person account. It's a standard account, another record type. And we join them together with an account contact relationship. We can also say that they're related to each other if we really want to describe their relationships. We can say these two are related to each other as siblings. This is parent-child, right? This is spouse. We can describe all of those together using the contact-to-contact relationship. And then when we say that this whole household uses this law firm, well, that's an account-to-account relationship. So we have all of this stuff gets aggregated into the one view, which is the relationship grouping. We're able to see, I've got this household, here are the members of the household, here are the roles they play in that household. I have related accounts, so we've set up trusts for one of the kids. That's its own discrete entity. A trust is a defined business entity. So we have their trust as its own related account. And then we have these other related contacts. He's related to the household because he's got a relationship with Rachel or with whomever. Right, so this is the killer app that makes the rest of the system operate. And an awful lot of stuff is based on this. So how does this stuff all get configured? This all gets configured by saying, I want to manage the members of this relationship group. I really wish that we could simply change the name of this to just call it household. 5 nines. It's just a household. That's what everybody calls it, is a household. But Salesforce wants to keep it generic, so they refer to them as relationship groups. So for these relationship groups, you're going to define who the members are. You define what are other groups or other organizations might be related to, what other counts there are. Well, to define those, there are 5 basic decisions that you have to make. You say, who's a member of the group? That's going to have to be a person account. That's an individual person. You need to define what role that member plays. So that's where you're just picking, they're a client, they're a dependent. You can completely customize what that is. It's a pick list and it's multi-select. You can pick more than one. That's the role they play in relationship to the household. You then have to say, what aggregations am I going to perform? What am I rolling up for that member? Well, in this case, we're rolling up their financial accounts, assets and liabilities, opportunities, and tasks. That's what I'm rolling up for Rachel. You need to say, who is the primary member of this household? What that really means is, who's the head of household? From the household's perspective, who's my main person? Excuse me. Primary group says the opposite. For each person, is this my main household? So a household can have only one primary member. A member can have only one primary household. So I can belong to multiple households, but I can only be the head of one of them. I'm sorry, I could be the head of multiples. Let me rephrase that. I can belong to multiple households. Only one of them can be my primary. Okay. Those are the core elements. Everything flows from that. And this discussion around primary member versus primary group is going to be a more complicated discussion to have just because of the nomenclature. Just remembering that primary member means head of household and primary group means, is this your main household? That's the distinction. So the cool part about this and where this becomes central is in the automation. The householding is really important in identifying, like, how do I know to aggregate financial accounts? How do I know to aggregate assets and liabilities if I want to do that? Well, it relies on some triggering. So we've got a client and that client has some financial accounts. That's cool. There are financial account triggers that roll up the value of those financial accounts to that client. Easily done. When you add that client to a household, there are triggers then on the account contact relationship that brand each one of those financial accounts with the identifier of that household. So now those accounts know what household they belong to. And that then allows us to do an aggregation of those financial accounts up to that household. All of that happens in real time using their triggers and some basic configuration. When you add a new financial account, that will automatically in the future then, because we know that financial account belongs to that person and that person belongs to that household, that means that that financial account will automatically be branded and will automatically be rolled up to the household. So that's why householding is so central to the rest of it. All of your questions around assets under management, all of your questions around my book of business, all of your questions around the 80-20 rule of, 80% of my AUM is living with 20% of my clients. How do I identify them and deal with them in aggregate? All of that relies upon householding and these aggregation rollups. So I'm going to pause there. That's a whole bunch to consume. I see we have a few questions in the chat. I can go ahead and answer those, or and after answering those, we can take a couple minutes to hear if there are any other questions.
I think you can start answering them, and then if anyone has any questions, you can take that then. Okay, so the first question, it's a really interesting question, I think, is life events like the customer journey in a financial services context? It can be. Think of it more as by default, out of the box, it's a static set of records you're creating that are aggregated together to give you a nice view, right? So you have, when a job occurs, you're recording the fact that they had a job change and when it happened, and it lets you know, oh, somebody has a new job. That's great. It also, and this is something Walter will go into tomorrow, it has extensive and built-in capabilities to automate the flow from there. So you can absolutely say, this new job occurred, therefore we're going to trigger these other events. But it's not quite like a customer journey if you're thinking in marketing terms, because it doesn't really take you from one area as a progression into another. It's more about identifying status and activity across a range. It's less of a progression and more of a flag.
The next question was, is person account, if person account is technically a contact, why does Salesforce create 2 records in the database? Well, it's because a person account is genuinely an account record. And the way that they have said, well, we need to get all of the individual characteristics of a person, right? You don't have social security number, you don't have date of birth, right? You don't have those kinds of first name and last name. Those things don't exist on an account record, they exist on a contact record. So what they've done is actually merge them together. And so because they're just leveraging, it's just magic, right? There are fields on the account record that when you modify, what it's doing is updating the contact record, and they're just providing the glue between those two. I personally think it's kind of weird that they actually do hit you twice with that, but they are legitimately creating 2 different records. One is an account record, one is a contact record, and this is not FSC, this is core Salesforce. Person accounts will be kept in sync. You can't break that. But they do hit you with both of them. It is technically 2 different records. The next question was, if a household is created and it's made of a couple X and Y and they divorce and then X marries A, will we be creating 2 or more household accounts? First, I would say, be careful about the use of the word account. I appreciate that you said household accounts. It's really important to clarify person account, household account, business account. Use the full term and not just the word account. So I appreciate that you did that there. Otherwise, you'll get very confused, especially when people start talking about how many accounts I have and they mean checking and investment. So the word account is really loaded in this context. In this case, yes, you would have multiple household accounts. X and Y, there's a household called the XY household. Well, they divorce and X marries A, you're going to create an XA household. You're then going to either mark X as inactive in the old XY household and add X as active to the new XA household, or you just remove them entirely from the old household. Either way, yes, you have one household. You know, one of my favorite expressions is always model reality. The reality is there are physically 2 households. Think of this as where people live, right? They don't live together anymore. X and Y don't anymore, but they do over there. Those 2 households still exist. X still belongs to that old household. It's just Y isn't there anymore. I'm sorry, I guess X isn't there anymore. However you want to put it. So yes, you would create a record to represent every discrete view of a household. And I'm not sure what this question from Tatiana is. Is this product FedRAMEd?
Is it FedRAMP?
I'm sorry, I don't know what FedRAMEd means.
So FedRAMP is can federal organizations use this product?
I'm not sure. I don't know whether I've not heard of an instance where somebody public sector, much less federal and specific, is using FSC, but it could very well be the case. I'd have to talk to Salesforce and find out. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, we're doing the DCS, the Department of Child Care Services for Indianapolis, and I just feel like this would have saved us a whole lot of heartache and is way better, visually to represent, kind of what's going on with the households and things like that. I'm kind of nerding out with you.
No, I think it's a good question. I don't know whether or not, I mean, the public sector licensing in Salesforce is a specialty world. And so that may very well be something that they may get access, for example, to relationship groups without having FSC because it's part of the industry platform. So I don't know, but that's an interesting question. I'll try to find that out.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to move on. Again, if there are more questions, put them in there. We'll tackle them in the next question section. I want to talk about security and sharing models and how that relates to interaction summaries. So just as a refresher and thinking about FSC in particular, this universe, as I said, of account sits in the middle, whether they're business accounts, whether they're households, whether they're people, that sits in the middle. And, we've got things that are dependent on that, right? we've got opportunities, we've got contacts, we've got contracts. Those things are highly dependent on the account object itself. Employment and education, those things are very specifically tied in, and those basically, they can't exist. Those are the children. They can't exist without the account. Well, financial accounts in FSC are a little bit different. Financial accounts, assets and liabilities, yes, technically they don't have to, I mean, in practice, they exist because you have an account. There's not much value in having those records otherwise. How do you have a checking account without identifying who the owner is, right? So you do have to supply that, but you don't supply it on a schema level. You don't supply that information at a data level. You supply that in the UI and through components. So that means that these are more like stepchildren. They're not lookup. I'm sorry, they're not master detail driven. They are lookup driven. So those elements stand apart and have to have kind of their own sharing models to support. That seems kind of weird that the sharing model being used to support accounts would not necessarily support the financial accounts that belong to those accounts. It's something that I get why they've done it, but it can be a little bit, it can be difficult to navigate sometimes. So the reason that this was set up this way is because it's not uncommon to have financial services firms that allow a lot of people to, a lot of service people and account servicing folks, back office folks, to access the financial accounts, but they shouldn't have any access to the client. They shouldn't know anything about the activity we're doing with the client. They shouldn't know anything about clients, but they have to know everything about the financial account. So in that way, you do have to have a different security model, but that drives some complexity. So in most organizations, you've got this, this is very common in most organizations, particularly in the FINS world. You've got William, he's a solo advisor, right? He's supported with some assistants. Henry and Beth, they're partners and they run their practice as a team supported by their assistants. And you've got Wendy, who's got, she's another sole practitioner. She's got her own assistants, but she's also getting support from some of the assistants that work with Henry and Beth. We've then got Keith. Well, Keith supports everybody. The challenge here is that standard account hierarchy, standard sharing and sharing settings don't do a good job of supporting this. And that could be fine if you're talking just about accounts alone. It becomes a problem when you're talking about other kinds of records, right? You're talking about non-account records, you're talking about financial account records, assets and liabilities. Well, you can't really count on things like role hierarchy and account teams to drive access to these other records like financial account that are not dependent on the account, on the household, on the person account. So there are a couple of different ways that this gets addressed. The first one is something that is part of FSC called compliant data sharing. This is sort of an amalgam of ad hoc sharing, account teams, sales teams, where what you're really saying is, I want to define a role. I want to define there's a role called account manager. And in that account manager role, I'm going to say, if you have the account manager role and you're related to an account object, right? You're looking at an account and you're just described as the account manager, you get read-only access, for example. Well, then you can group those meaningfully, right? So you can say that one person is a member of the financial team, another person is a member of the document management team, and the entire financial team and document management team together, those all represent one participant role. You can then share your records with that participant. I could share a record with document management. I could share a record with a person describing them by that role. When I describe them by that role, they get whatever access is defined for that role. This means that I can then describe both somebody's relationship to a client and their access level to a client just by declaring what role they play. So if I decide later on I want that role. No, we actually want account managers to have read-write access. All I have to do is update the participant role to say, you've got this kind of access. I don't have to update everybody's, I don't have to update David's relationship to the account and Scott's relationship to the account and Dave's relationship to the account. I don't have to update all of their sharing. I just say, well, now everybody in the system that is called account manager, they now have had their permissions increased. So it's nice to be able to assign that by role and not worry about the actual sharing element of it, just centralize that functionality. It does allow you additionally to delegate this, right? You don't have to be a full-blown admin to do this stuff. You just have to have these permissions, right? You have to say, you have to have the rights to configure this data sharing. And then if you want to be somebody that gets access based on it, then they get the use compliant sharing. But if you were giving somebody the ability to configure this, you have the rights then to grant, to control what those access levels are for participants and to create new participant roles. One important element of CDS is that you have no choice. If you want to use interaction summaries, you're going to have to use CDS. The value of interaction summaries, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is really about sharing information, and it is explicitly built on using CDS to do that. So depending on who you define as a participant in an interaction and what role they have as that participant, that's what stuff will be shared with. You can make that definition. Well, it doesn't say, and by the way, just share it with person X. It's more complicated, but that's the whole goal here. Keep in mind that compliant data sharing is very, very limited in scope. It is explicitly limited to the account object, the opportunity object, and to interaction summaries. That's it. So this sharing model is not a sharing model that you can use, for example, for financial account. It's now I believe I don't have any insider knowledge that says this overtly. So I'm not even saying safe harbor. I'm just saying I believe that this is a natural growth. They're going to be taking this and extending it to financial accounts, extending it to other elements of the FSC world. But because CDS is inherently part of the industry's platform, not the FSC specific extension, I believe that will have to be an FSC specific extension that they add in. So right now it doesn't support that. It does support interaction summaries. Interaction summaries are something it took me a little while to get my head around. An interaction is basically, any meeting, anytime that you speak with somebody, anytime that you have an interaction with the client, anything you currently log a call or create an event to capture. It's especially useful if you are sharing that, if you want to share the outcomes of that and identify the attendees by their roles. That's really valuable, and interactions are valuable to do that. The interaction summaries are the distribution of information about that interaction. So you meet with somebody on a given day, a given time, and here's who you met with. Now, how do you tell people that you had that meeting? How is it exposed in the system? That's using interaction summaries. It does not take the place of native activities. This is not a replacement for native activities. It is another element. I think this is a place where there's going to need to be, every time we've implemented this, we've had to do some additional automation to tie activities into interactions, to tie a specific event, to tie logged calls, whatever. In order to do that, I think that there's some custom work that has to be done to make that happen. I think that's probably part of the growth trajectory. And my experience with FSC is that over the years, every release, there's something new and cool being added in that's valuable. So I'm seeing this grow quickly. I think interaction summaries will grow to that. But the bottom line is, it's really about security, right? It's really about identifying who gets to see the fact that you had this and that you're describing what happened. I'm putting a whole bunch of financial details in here that need to be locked down to the underwriting team. Nobody else should be able to see those. I can create a summary of that interaction for the underwriting team and a different summary of that interaction for everybody else. And then those get shared. So it's pretty simple to create. It's pretty simple to create that interaction. You create that single interaction record. You identify who are the attendees there, what people that know their users there, who are the contacts, and yes, that will support person accounts. Who are the contacts that were there, and then you choose who to share that with. When you create your interaction summary and you write up your notes in your interaction summary, that's where you perform the sharing. The summaries then appear. There are homepage components that let you see all the interaction summaries that are going on. These pop up just like activity. There's activities component on an account page. It does the same thing. Excuse me. You can see what the interaction summaries are that relate to that client. Now, if this model does not govern everything, how do you make sure that you're governing financial accounts based on what happens with a given client? The best mechanism I have for that is not an FSC mechanism. This is a custom group sharing model where you're effectively going to be sharing these subsidiary records using public groups. And then you're going to be modeling those, you're going to be managing those public groups by proxy. A couple of custom objects are used to define what are the teams and who belongs to those teams. As you create those records behind the scenes, it creates public groups and public group members. And then when you create a financial account, or when you create a client, or when you create whatever, it does some custom lookup. It does some custom behavior to say, oh, okay, well, based on who the owner of this financial account is, let me go find the public group and create a sharing record for that financial account. That way I'm keeping the rules that drive the client access in sync. I create this team to manage my public groups, and I create those sharing records that manages all my sharing. The benefit of this is that you get a lot of end user flexibility, right? You can give people access to maintain these objects that you would never give access to maintain public groups. And you can use it for all objects. So there's a single point of management for sharing. So I just wanted to put this out here as a mechanism for driving sharing and visibility in the system. Compliant data sharing doesn't extend as far as I think it eventually will. It doesn't extend as far as I think it needs to support financial account, assets and liabilities, custom objects, all of which should share the same sharing, the same access level that the client should. So it does take some custom work to get that built out. So again, it's a big chunk to digest. Questions. I only see one question in the chat. And that's asking, I'm not sure, it's saying, well, what is the difference between a participant role and a financial account role? A participant role is saying when you participate in a client, specifically in a client, the participant role is asking, let me get to it here. There we go. So participant role is specifically saying when you serve this function for a client, you get this access to information about that client, right? You get this degree of access to that information. Financial account role is a different animal. Financial account role is saying, I have a financial account, it's standalone. How do I know who the clients are that relate to that financial account? Financial account role has nothing to do with security. Financial account role is simply a way of typifying who it is that has a relationship to that financial account. So in the FSC world, when you have a financial account, when you're creating your financial accounts and you're declaring the ownership of those financial accounts, and this whole model takes place where you've got this person owning these, every person that has any relationship to a financial account gets a financial account role record. But that has nothing, that has to do with the relationship between a client and a financial account. or between a client and their correspondence for insurance and so forth. It defines their relationship. It does not define security. Security is about our user relationship to the data. Any other questions about that? Alrighty. So let's talk about the data processing engine. Personally, I love this. It nearly took my life. It was very hard for me to get my head around, but once I got my head around it, it is incredibly powerful. When FSC was first rolled out, those triggers that do the aggregation of the financial account to the client and the financial accounts up to the household, those triggers, those are fine, and there's some batch versions of them. Those are fine if you have relatively small data volumes. But I found pretty quickly that I wanted to do 20 different aggregations. I want to aggregate things by record type. I want to aggregate things by ownership. I want to aggregate things by a number of different characteristics. Every one of those aggregations, when I was dealing with an FSC org with a couple 100,000 clients and a few million records, every one of those aggregations using the old model was taking 4 hours, and I had 20 of those to do. So every 80 hours, I was going to get the numbers appropriate 80 hours ago. That was a real problem. They have addressed this now, and they've addressed it in a very cool way. So it's this batch-oriented tool specifically focused on large data volumes. So anytime you're talking about data volumes, they're going to stretch how much SOCL can naturally handle. If you've got a bunch of conditional calculations required and they're for related objects, so we're not talking about simple roll-ups, simple lookups, when you do not have to have the answer in real time, because this is not a real-time solution, this is a batch solution, and you really don't want to go in and start writing code for it, that's when you start using DPE. So a really classic example of this would be, we've got all of these different owners of these financial accounts with different relationships, right? A is the primary owner. A owns these two financial accounts as the primary owner. Owner B is the joint owner for these two, right? Owner C is the primary owner of this one. Owner E is only a joint owner, owner of 6, and doesn't have any other primary. What we want to make sure that we're doing is aggregating all of these up to the appropriate clients. I want to know for owner A, what's the value of all financial accounts for which you're the primary? And I want to know it for all those for which are the secondary, the joint. I need to know those two numbers for owner A. How do I roll all of those up and differentiate those? Those of you that have done development and aggregation, I imagine your head is spinning. Writing that in SOCL by itself is complicated. Now do it across millions of records. What we really want to do is be able to do these distinct calculations for each client, breaking out by record type, breaking out by ownership, breaking out by whether it's held versus held away. That's basically a matrix of a bunch of different calculations to perform for every individual client. And the trick is you don't want to update that client a whole bunch of times, right? I don't want to update A for this circumstance and for that circumstance and for this circumstance. I only want to update it one time. Show me the dollar amount for primary and joint. Show me the count for primary and joint. That's all. I want to update it one time, because otherwise, every single time I update that account, it's going to fire a bunch of triggers, and I don't want it to do that. So that's where DPE comes in. So in DPE, what you're doing is replicating your data to Tableau, effectively. You're replicating that data. You define what are the filters I'm looking for. You define some formulas and aggregations to that replicated data. And then you tell it performance calculation, do the aggregation, and write it back into Salesforce. So you use Salesforce to define all of this and send these elements to it. You define what are formulas, you define the filters, you define the aggregations, you tell it how to map the results, and that all becomes a definition. You then generate a batch job in Salesforce, which sends the replicated data and all those definitions back to Tableau, where those calculations are performed, and then it reaches back in via API and updates the data in Salesforce. So those processes that I had to, that I had to think through, involving these 20 different calculations that I'm saying we're taking 80 hours to do, I could now build a very carefully planned structure here that says, okay, I'm going to be setting certain filters. I'm going to use formulas to define other data sets, which I then aggregate, blah, blah, blah. It's a whole bunch of detailed stuff. Once I define what this is, that exact same run for all those millions of records was taking about 20 minutes. So literally, I went from several days to 20 minutes by using this. It is a really remarkable tool. Now, in this deck, which I don't know, Gerline, I'm assuming that we'll be sending out or would be available on request, there are a series of other slides I've got that define what the methodology is for doing DPE. How do you have to think about it? How do you actually set this up? How does it differ from the ways that you think about standard native stuff? What is this process flow that it goes through to define it? How do you track errors? All that kind of stuff, that's all defined in the appendix for the deck. But I really just wanted to plant the seed that this whole thing is incredibly powerful. Once you get your head around these differences, and it's not SOCL, it's not SQL, it's a different way of structuring it. If you've already used Einstein, it should be relatively familiar. Once you get your head around that, it's a really, really powerful tool. So I'm going to pause there because that was a big chunk of stuff to bring up. And see if there are any questions. So this is asking, when should I use DPE over rollup by configuration? I assume you're talking about rollup by lookup configuration. The place where you would use it, I mean, really, these are the rules. Use it anytime you have a large data set that's going to make SOCL too slow or hammer your governance limits. You're going to use it when you're talking about having to perform calculations involving complex grouping as well as multiple related objects. If you do not have to have a real-time answer. Look, if it's a real-time answer and you're violating the, you're stumbling across these first two, you should probably rethink the architecture. You're not going to get a real-time answer if these two things are involved. There's just no good way to get a real-time answer with those two involved. And you don't want to write some enormous batchable class to be able to do that calculation. Setting aside however complicated it may be to come up with this kind of structure, right, to do this kind of complex querying in SOCL, that's when you would not do it in SOCL. Now, when you use it over rollup by lookup, again, the same thing applies. So rollup by lookup is explicitly intended to govern a very, very narrow set. Right? Rollup by lookup is really governing this, right? A change happens to a financial account. A change happens to their householding for a person. That's when you generally want to use the rollup by lookup rules, when it is triggered in real time. In every org of sufficient size for me to use DPE because of those other considerations, I have turned off all of these summary metadata, right? So in FSC, you define, well, who should be allowed to declare that you're part of the household and brand the financial accounts, and who should be allowed to aggregate the financial accounts. Well, I've turned off all the aggregation, which means that the rollup by lookup stuff does not happen for any batch load of data ever. It only happens when individual users make individual changes to individual households for clients. Okay, the last thing I wanted to go over is just to touch on third-party apps. Now, there are a variety, the App Exchange is huge. And I think that most of us that have been in the ecosystem for a while recognize that not all third-party apps are even on the App Exchange. Some of them are going to be private listings. Some of them are entire platforms. And so the idea of, install for an App Exchange doesn't make a lot of sense. There are several specifically built for FSC. So we still have like utility documentation, workflow management stuff like DocuSign and Conga. And there are some very specific FSC pieces built for DocuSign and Conga. And then, there's Informatica and MuleSoft, that kind of ETL stuff. There are elements of those that are built specifically to work around FSC attributes of different ways, different kinds. Those are valuable. And those are available still and FSC centric and mindful. You then have got the specialty integration stuff, right? You've got Adapar, you've got avenues to Jack Henry, these things about aggregating data in InvestNet. If what you want to do is see their external dashboarding, InvestNet understands how to interact with FSC and use the financial account object and use the householding permissions and financial account roles and all of that stuff. InvestNet's good about that. Tamarack will also do a bunch of that aggregation. Sandbox, particularly when you're dealing with something like Encino, Sandbox is mindful of the FSC platform, and it's got a bunch of FSC specific integration steps that it can follow. And then you've got the platforms, right? You've got for operations orchestration, you've got stuff like Encino for commercial lending and commercial management. You've got stuff like Skyence for retail client onboarding, particularly for wealth management. Those are whole platforms that get implemented on top of FSC. In fairness, Skyence is completely built on FSC and Encino has hooks into FSC, but those are entire platforms that have mindfulness around FSC. And there are more. There's a whole section on the App Exchange that talks about the kind of stuff available to them. So the only other piece is that coming, and it's something that will be touched on tomorrow by Walter, coming is going to be orchestration stuff, which allows you to build a lot more of your own local orchestration. You're still going to find specialization involved in tools like Skyence and Encino that you don't want to rebuild. It's so much easier to use FSC and leverage its capabilities if you put these tools on top of it. So that's it. That is high level stuff. Understand that this presentation, this description is part of what I customarily do as a 2 full day exploration of the technology. So this is really just meant to touch the surface and to say what's possible. There's a whole lot more detail available. A number of other really cool components will be shared when Walter does his presentation tomorrow. But we've got a couple minutes left. I wanted to see if anybody has questions. Don't bother putting them in the chat. Just shout out, ask. We can answer anything that you got. I can try.